The basement of the Black Dog Tavern smelled of tallow smoke and spilled gin, and Marianne Vance kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards as she carried a tray of ale toward the long table where the men had gathered to bid on crates of smuggled brandy. She had worked here for 11 months, ever since her father's death left her with nothing but his debts and a name that made merchants turn away when she asked for honest work. Tonight, she wore her plainest grey dress, the one that made her invisible among the sailors and traders who filled the room, and invisibility suited her fine. It suited her fine until Master Corvus walked in. She recognized his boots before she saw his face, polished leather that cost more than she earned in a season, tapping impatiently against the stone floor as he crossed toward her. Corvus was a debt collector by trade and a cruel man by nature, and he had been hunting her for weeks over the money her late father owed to half the merchants in Oakhaven. She set the tray down too quickly, ale sloshing over the rim, and turned to slip through the crowd toward the stairs. His hand closed around her forearm before she reached them. "Running again, Miss Vance?" His voice carried just enough to draw glances from the nearest tables, which was precisely what he wanted. Corvus liked an audience for his cruelty. It made his threats land harder. "Your father's debt has grown another £12 this month. I think it's time we discussed how a girl with no family and no prospects intends to pay a debt like that." His grip tightened, and Marianne felt her pulse jump into her throat. She had faced him before, always alone, always in some back alley where no one would interfere. She had never expected him to come for her here, in front of witnesses, as though he no longer cared who saw. "Let go of me," she said, keeping her voice steady though her arm throbbed under his fingers. "I told you I need more time." "Time isn't something I sell," Corvus said, and pulled her half a step toward the door. That was when a hand caught his wrist. It happened so fast that Marianne barely registered the movement. One moment Corvus was dragging her forward, and the next, a tall man in a dark travelling coat had wrenched his hand away from her arm with enough force to make Corvus stumble back against the table. The tavern's noise dropped by half as heads turned. The stranger who had intervened did not look like the merchants and dock workers filling the room. His coat was well cut, his boots free of mud despite the state of the streets outside, and though he wore no visible signs of rank, something in the way he held himself made the crowd instinctively give him room. "Touch her again," the man said, his voice low and even, "and you're finished." Corvus straightened, rubbing his wrist, his face reddening with humiliation rather than pain. "This is a private matter, sir, and none of your concern. The girl owes." "I heard what she owes." The stranger reached into his coat and withdrew a leather purse, tossing it onto the table with a heavy clink that silenced whatever protest Corvus had been building. "That should cover her father's debt twice over. Draw up whatever papers release her from your claim and do it tonight." Corvus stared at the purse, then at the man's face, and something shifted in his expression, recognition perhaps, or the beginning of caution. He did not ask the stranger's name. He simply counted the coins with shaking hands and muttered that the papers would be ready within the hour. Marianne stood frozen through all of it, her arm still stinging where Corvus had gripped her, watching the man who had just spent a small fortune to free her from a debt he had no reason to care about. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first guessed, with dark hair swept back from a face that held no warmth for Corvus, but softened slightly when he finally turned to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No, only—" She stopped herself, unsure what to say to a man who had just upended her entire life in the space of a few minutes. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "No," he admitted, "but I know a man like Corvus when I see one, and I've little patience for those who prey on people who cannot fight back." She studied him more closely then, noting the quality of his coat again, the way the tavern keeper had gone pale and bowed slightly when the stranger first entered, the deference in Corvus's retreat. Whoever this man was, he was no ordinary merchant playing at cards in a dockside basement. "You have my gratitude, sir," she said carefully, "though I confess I don't know who to thank." "Christopher Sterling," he said, and something in the way the surrounding men suddenly found reasons to look away told her the name carried more weight than he'd let on. "Duke of Ashcombe," if titles matter to you. They mattered a great deal, and Marianne felt the floor shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the tavern's uneven boards. A duke had just paid off her father's debt in front of half the port town, and she had no idea yet that this was only the very beginning of what he would come to owe her, nor what she intended to ask of him before the night was through. The papers releasing her from Corvus's claim were signed within the hour, exactly as Christopher had promised, and Marianne found herself standing outside the Black Dog Tavern with nothing but the clothes on her back and a debt of gratitude she had no idea how to repay. She expected the Duke to leave then, his good deed finished, his conscience satisfied. Instead, he gestured toward a waiting carriage, its lanterns casting pools of amber light onto the wet cobblestones. "I've taken rooms for you at an inn near the harbour," he said. "You needn't return to whatever lodging you had before. Corvus knows your face now, and men like him don't forget a humiliation easily." She should have simply thanked him and let the carriage carry her wherever he intended. Instead, as the horses began to move and the tavern's lights faded behind them, Marianne found herself studying the man across from her with a calculation that surprised even her. He had not asked for anything in return. He had not so much as glanced at her the way men sometimes did when they thought a woman owed them something for a kindness. That, more than anything, convinced her he was worth the risk of honesty. "You paid a stranger's debt tonight without blinking," she said. "That isn't the act of a man who does nothing without reason. So I'll ask you plainly, Your Grace. Was it truly kindness that brought you into that tavern? Or were you already looking for someone like me?" Christopher's expression shifted, the polite warmth cooling into something more guarded. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that dukes do not spend their evenings in dockside gambling dens unless they're hunting for something the respectable parts of town won't offer them." She folded her hands in her lap, steadying herself before the words that would either secure her future or ruin it entirely. "I knew Corvus would come for me tonight. I made certain of it. I let word slip through the tavern that I'd be alone and unguarded because I needed a man of standing to see it happen in public, where he'd feel obliged to intervene rather than simply pay Corvus off in private and forget me by morning." The carriage rattled over an uneven stretch of road, and for a long moment Christopher said nothing at all. She watched him carefully, bracing for anger, for the cold dismissal she'd seen from noblemen who disliked being outmaneuvered by anyone, let alone a servant girl in a borrowed grey dress. Instead, he laughed. It was a short, disbelieving sound, but genuine. "You arranged your own rescue," he said slowly, "and chose me specifically to perform it." "I chose you because your reputation precedes you, Your Grace. They say the Duke of Ashcombe cannot walk past a wrong without setting it right, whatever the cost to himself. I gambled that the stories were true." She met his eyes without flinching. "I needed a man who could not simply be bribed away, and I needed him before Corvus's men discovered what I've been hiding since my father died." "And what is that?" Marianne reached into the hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her cloak, a precaution she'd taken the moment she understood Corvus intended to search her lodgings, and withdrew a small brass disc etched with a spiral of numbers and symbols worn smooth from years of handling. She held it out, letting the carriage lantern catch the metal. "My father was a shipping clerk before he fell into debt, but before that, he sailed. 30 years ago, he served aboard a merchant vessel called the Osprey's Grace, which carried a private cargo of historic artifacts commissioned for a nobleman's collection. The ship never reached its destination. Officially, it was lost in a storm off the northern coast, and every soul aboard drowned with her." She turned the disc over in her fingers. "Unofficially, my father was one of 3 men who survived, and he spent the rest of his life certain the wreck could be found because he'd hidden the true coordinates before the ship went down, encoded in his private logbooks so that no one else could claim the cargo for themselves." Christopher leaned forward, the lantern light carving sharp lines across his face. "Your father kept the location of a lost fortune a secret for 30 years and told no one." "He told me. Or rather, he left me the means to find it, though he never lived to explain how the cipher worked in full. This disc unlocks half the puzzle. The logbooks themselves are safe, hidden where Corvus will never think to search, but even with them I can only decode part of the route. My father split the information deliberately, Your Grace, because he trusted no single person with the whole of it, not even his own daughter, not entirely. Her voice caught slightly on that admission, an old grief she rarely let show. I need someone with resources, protection, and enough standing that no magistrate would dare question his motives, to help me finish what he started. And in return? In return, you'll have first claim on whatever we recover. Artifacts commissioned for a noble collection 30 years ago would be worth a considerable fortune today, quite apart from their historical value. I ask only for what's owed to my family's name, the debt cleared, and enough to reclaim what little we once had. Christopher studied her for a long moment, and Marianne could see him weighing her, the way she imagined he weighed every decision that mattered, carefully, without haste, but with a mind clearly already turning toward action rather than doubt. You are either the most resourceful woman I have ever met, he said finally, or the most dangerous. Possibly both. Does that frighten you, Your Grace? No, he said, and there was something almost like admiration beneath the wariness in his voice. It intrigues me considerably more than it should. Very well, Miss Vance. Show me what your father left behind, and let us see whether this fortune of yours is real or simply the last desperate hope of a dying man who couldn't bear to leave his daughter with nothing at all. The carriage rolled on through the darkness towards Stirling Manor, and Marianne allowed herself, for the first time in months, a small and cautious breath of relief. Stirling Manor rose out of the morning mist like something from an old ballad, its grey stone walls softened by ivy and its windows catching the first pale light of dawn. Marianne had never seen a house so large, nor so quiet, and as the carriage rolled up the long gravel drive, she found herself smoothing her travel-worn dress with hands that would not quite stay still. You'll want for nothing here, Christopher said, watching her take in the sight of the place. But I imagine sleep is the last thing on your mind this morning. He was right. She had spent the final hour of the journey turning the brass disc over and over in her fingers, and now that they had arrived, the thought of waiting even one more day to see her father's logbooks felt unbearable. Christopher seemed to sense the same urgency, for rather than showing her to a guest chamber, he led her straight through the entrance hall and down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced Stirling ancestors into a study filled floor to ceiling with books. This is where I do my thinking, he said, moving to a locked cabinet behind his desk. It should serve well enough for unraveling a man's riddles. Marianne drew the logbooks from beneath her cloak, 3 slim volumes bound in cracked leather, their pages swollen with age and salt air. She had kept them hidden inside a false-bottomed trunk since her father's death, terrified that Corvus or one of his creditor associates might search her lodgings and discover them by accident. Now, laid out across the polished surface of a duke's writing desk, they looked almost too fragile for the weight of what they carried. He wrote in cipher from the moment he left the sea, she explained, opening the first volume to a page dense with columns of numbers and strange symbolic marks. I've spent years trying to make sense of it on my own, but I could never get past the first several pages. I always assumed I was missing something my father meant to give me before he died. Christopher fetched the brass disc from where she'd set it and held it against the page, turning it slowly until the spiral of etched numbers aligned with a repeating pattern in the text. A cipher wheel, he murmured. Your father built himself quite the puzzle. It took the better part of the morning. Marianne read the encoded lines aloud, while Christopher turned the disc to match each shifting pattern, and slowly, painstakingly, the numbers resolved into words, headings, ship names, dates that matched what little she already knew of her father's final voyage. There was a fierce, private thrill in watching 30 years of silence finally give way to meaning, and more than once she caught herself laughing aloud at some small triumph, only to find Christopher watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. By mid-morning, they had decoded enough to piece together the shape of the truth. The Osprey's Grace had indeed carried a private commission of historic artifacts, sculptures, manuscripts, and jeweled relics gathered from a nobleman's estate abroad, intended as a gift for the king's own collection, before the ship vanished in a storm off the northern coast. Marianne's father had survived the wreck, along with 2 other crewmen, and in the chaos of the sinking, he had managed to salvage the cargo's true resting place from the ship's navigator before the man drowned. He had spent the following decades as a shipping clerk, quietly gathering the resources and knowledge to one day retrieve what he'd hidden. But debt, illness, and finally death had stolen that chance from him. "There," Christopher said at last, tapping a final decoded passage. "Coordinates. A stretch of coastline north of here, near the cliffs. This should be enough to find the wreck itself." But as Marianne read the passage again, her excitement faltered. The numbers were incomplete, a string of figures that pointed toward a general region of coastline without ever narrowing to an exact location. She flipped forward through the remaining pages, searching for a continuation that never came. The logbook simply ended, the final entries devoted to ordinary matters of her father's later life, with no further mention of the wreck at all. "That's all there is," she said slowly, dread creeping into her voice. "The route stops halfway." Christopher frowned, taking the volume from her and scanning the last pages himself, as though he might find something she'd missed. "Your father wouldn't have left the puzzle unfinished, not a man who spent 30 years protecting this secret." "No," Marianne agreed, and then, all at once, something her father had said to her years before returned to her with painful clarity. She had been a girl of perhaps 12, sitting at his knee while he told her half stories he never finished, and once, only once, he had mentioned a locked box kept somewhere safe from prying hands. The Guildhouse. He worked there before he took his post as a clerk. He was a member once, before the debts began. He told me long ago that some things were safer locked away where no thief would think to look, in a vault that required more than one key to open. "The old Guildhouse in Oakhaven," Christopher said, understanding dawning. "It's been abandoned for years, ever since the Merchants' Association dissolved. If your father hid the remaining coordinates there before his death, then that's where we'll find the rest of the route." Marianne felt a fresh surge of resolve steady her nerves. Half a mystery solved was no mystery solved at all, and she had not survived Corvus, buried her father, and gambled everything on a stranger's mercy, only to abandon the search now. "We'll need to return to Oakhaven." Christopher closed the logbook gently, as though aware of how much it meant to her, and met her eyes with a seriousness that hadn't been there before. "Then we go back tonight." "But Miss Vance, if your father hid something valuable enough to protect for 30 years, we should assume others may have suspected its existence long before you ever came looking for it. We'll need to be careful." Neither of them yet knew how right he was, nor how quickly that caution would be tested. They left Stirling Manor before the last of the afternoon light had faded, Christopher insisting they travel by the same carriage that had carried Marianne there, its curtains drawn to avoid drawing attention on the road back toward Oakhaven. He had said little since their discovery in the study, but Marianne noticed the change in him all the same. A new watchfulness in the way he checked the road behind them through the gap in the curtain, a stillness that hadn't been there during their earlier journey. "You're worried," she said, breaking the silence somewhere past the 2nd-mile marker. "I'm careful," he corrected. "There's a difference, though I grant the two often look alike from the outside." He let the curtain fall back into place. "Corvus struck me as a man more concerned with coin than curiosity last night, but a man like that doesn't survive in his trade without learning to smell an opportunity. He watched me pay a fortune to free a debt-ridden servant girl from her obligations. Men who collect debts for a living understand value better than most, Miss Vance. He'll have asked himself why." Marianne pulled her cloak tighter, though the carriage was warm enough. She hadn't considered, in her single-minded focus on the logbooks, that her carefully staged rescue might have planted a different kind of suspicion in Corvus's mind. Not that a duke had shown an act of charity, but that a duke had recognized something worth far more than the debt he'd paid to claim it. "You think he suspects there's more to this than my father's debts?" "I think a man like Corvus doesn't need proof to act on greed. Suspicion alone is often enough." Christopher's jaw tightened. "And if he spent the day making inquiries about my movements, or yours, He may already know we return to the manor together rather than parting ways, as any ordinary rescue would suggest. As if summoned by the thought itself, the carriage lurched suddenly beneath them, the driver's shout cutting through the evening air, a heartbeat before the sound of hoofbeats reached Marianne's ears. Not the steady rhythm of their own team, but a second, faster set closing from behind. Christopher was at the curtain in an instant, drawing it back just enough to look. "Riders," he said grimly. 4, perhaps 5, moving fast. "Corvus?" I doubt he'd come himself. He's not a man who enjoys getting his own hands dirty when he can pay others to do it for him. Christopher rapped sharply on the roof of the carriage, calling out an instruction to the driver that Marianne couldn't quite hear over the growing thunder of hooves. The carriage lurched again, picking up speed, wheels rattling violently over the uneven road as the driver urged the horses into a full gallop. Marianne gripped the edge of her seat, her heart hammering as she risked a glance through the gap in the curtain. The riders were closer now, dark shapes against the dimming sky, and though she couldn't make out their faces, something about the way they rode, with purpose, without hesitation, spread out to prevent any easy escape, told her these were not travelers who happened to share the road. "They mean to stop us," she said. "They mean to search us, more likely, or frighten us into surrendering whatever we're carrying." Christopher reached beneath his seat and withdrew a slim wooden case, opening it to reveal a brace of pistols that had clearly been kept there for exactly this kind of circumstance. He did not load them, not yet, but the sight of them settled something anxious in his expression into cold resolve. "The main road offers no cover and no advantage. If we continue on this path, we'll be caught within the mile." "Then where?" He rapped again on the roof, and Marianne felt the carriage swing hard to the left, the smooth road giving way almost immediately to something rougher, narrower, the branches of overhanging trees scraping against the carriage windows as they plunged off the highway and into the deep shadow of what she would later learn was called Whistling Woods, a stretch of dense, ancient forest that travelers avoided after dark, more from superstition than genuine danger, though tonight it offered something far more valuable than any legend could. It offered concealment. The carriage slowed as the trees thickened around them, the driver navigating by memory or instinct along a path Marianne could barely make out even when she pressed her face close to the glass. Behind them, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew confused, scattered, the riders clearly unfamiliar with the woodland paths that Christopher's driver seemed to know by heart. "He's driven this route before," Marianne said, some of the tension in her chest easing slightly as the sounds of pursuit began to fade behind them. "Old Godfrey has served my family for 30 years. There isn't a road or footpath within 20 miles of Stirling Manor he doesn't know better than his own hands." Christopher finally allowed himself to lean back against the seat, though he kept the pistol case open across his knees, unwilling to fully release his guard until the danger had passed entirely. "We'll lose them in the woods, but we can't return to the main road tonight, not until we're certain they've given up the chase." Marianne nodded, though her mind had already moved past the immediate danger and toward the deeper, more troubling implication of what had just happened. If Corvus, or whoever had sent these riders, was willing to pursue a duke's carriage through open countryside on nothing more than suspicion, then whatever her father had hidden in that Guildhouse vault was worth far more than even she had imagined. And that meant the danger waiting for them in Oakhaven would only grow sharper the closer they came to finding it. "There's shelter not far from here," Christopher said after a long moment, watching her carefully as though he could read the worry gathering behind her eyes. "An old coaching inn, high on the ridge above the woods. We can wait out the night there, plan our approach to the Guildhouse properly, and let Godfrey confirm we haven't been followed before we risk the roads again." Marianne managed a small, tired smile. "It seems, Your Grace, that your reputation for nobility has already cost you a rather eventful evening." "It seems, Miss Vance," Christopher replied, the ghost of dry humor returning to his voice despite everything, "that I chose an extraordinarily inconvenient night to play the hero." The coaching inn sat alone atop the ridge, its windows glowing faintly against the darkness of the surrounding hills, a squat stone building that had clearly seen better decades, but offered warmth and privacy in equal measure. Godfrey brought the carriage to a halt in the small yard behind the stables, and Christopher helped Marianne down before speaking quietly with the innkeeper, arranging 2 separate rooms and a private parlour where they might talk without curious ears listening through thin walls. By the time they settled into the parlour, a fire crackling in the small hearth and a pot of tea growing cold between them, Marianne finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the evening's events. Her hands, she noticed, had not entirely stopped trembling since the riders first appeared on the road behind them. "You've gone quiet," Christopher observed, watching her from across the small table. "I keep thinking of my father," she admitted. "He spent 30 years carrying this secret alone, terrified enough of what might happen if the wrong person learned of it that he never even told me the whole truth while he lived. I always thought that fear was simply the illness talking, near the end. Now I wonder if he knew exactly what kind of danger this would bring and tried to spare me from it for as long as he could." Christopher was quiet for a moment, turning his teacup slowly in his hands. "My own father died believing certain truths were better carried to the grave than spoken aloud. I understand something of what it means to inherit a silence you never asked for." It was the first time he had offered her anything personal since they'd met, and Marianne found herself studying him with fresh curiosity, wondering what weight a duke might carry that could possibly echo her own. She didn't ask. Some griefs, she understood, needed to be offered freely rather than pried loose. "We should speak plainly about what happens once we find the rest of this treasure," she said instead, steering the conversation towards safer, more practical ground. "You've risked a great deal tonight, on nothing more than my word and a half-finished riddle. I won't have you regretting that generosity once the danger is behind us." "What did you have in mind?" Marianne had turned the question over in her mind since the carriage first left Stirling Manor, and now she laid it out with the same careful precision she might have used balancing accounts for a household she no longer had. "My family once held a small estate outside Oakhaven, before my father's debts forced its sale to settle what he owed. It's modest by the standards of a house like yours, Your Grace, but it was ours, and I should like it back more than I want any share of jewels or sculptures pulled from a shipwreck. Whatever historical value the cargo holds beyond that, I ask no claim to it. Let it go to your collection, or wherever a duke's word carries it. I want only my father's name cleared of debt and our home returned to us." Christopher considered this for longer than she expected, his expression unreadable in the low firelight. "That's a remarkably modest request, considering the fortune your father protected for 30 years. "I've never wanted a fortune," she said simply. "I wanted a father who didn't die exhausted and afraid, and a home that couldn't be taken from beneath us the moment misfortune struck. Since I can't have the first, I'll settle for whatever version of the second is still within reach." Something shifted in his expression then, softening in a way that made Marianne acutely aware of how close their chairs had drawn together over the course of the evening, though neither of them had moved. "Then let us make it a formal arrangement," he said. "Once the artifacts are recovered and your family's debts fully cleared, I will personally see to the return of your estate, purchased back at whatever price is required and deeded to you outright. The historical pieces themselves I'll place in the town museum rather than my own collection. Your father protected them for 30 years, believing they belonged to something greater than any single man's private hoard, and I find I agree with him." Marianne blinked, caught entirely off guard. "The museum? You could keep them for yourself and no one would question it. A duke's private collection is hardly unusual." "No," he agreed, "but I find I'd rather not build my own legacy on the back of your father's suffering. Let the artifacts belong to Oakhaven itself, to the people whose port your father sailed from, and let your family's name be remembered for uncovering them rather than merely surviving the debts left in their wake." It was, Marianne thought, an unexpectedly generous vision for a man who had every right to claim the greater share for himself, and she found herself unable to entirely mask her surprise. "You continue to defy every expectation I had of dukes, Your Grace." "And you continue to defy every expectation I had of banquet servers," he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting into something almost like a smile. "Perhaps we're both rather more than either of us first appeared." They drafted the terms of their arrangement that night by candlelight, Christopher writing in a careful hand while Marianne dictated the particulars, and by the time the fire had burned down to embers, something had shifted between them that neither fully acknowledged aloud. A partnership no longer built merely on convenience and coin, but on a growing, cautious trust that neither of them had expected to find in a stranger met across a tavern floor. Outside, the wind moved restlessly through the pines on the ridge, and somewhere in the darkness below, riders who had lost their trail for the night were already planning how best to pick it up again by morning. They left the inn before dawn, while mist still clung low to the hills and the world held the particular hush that comes only in the hour before sunrise. Godfrey had confirmed no riders had passed the ridge road overnight, but Christopher remained cautious all the same, insisting they enter Oakhaven through the back lanes rather than risk the main thoroughfare where Corvus's associates might be watching for a duke's carriage. The old guild house stood near the harbour's edge, a once grand building now given over to dust and disuse, its windows boarded and its heavy front doors sealed with a rusted chain that hadn't been disturbed in years. Marianne led them instead around to a narrow cellar entrance, half hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown ivy, the kind of forgotten access point only someone who'd once belonged to the place would know to look for. "My father brought me here once, as a girl," she explained, working a small iron key from the same hidden pocket that had held the brass disc. "Before the Merchants' Association dissolved, he wanted me to see where he'd spent so many years of his working life. I never understood, until last night, why he insisted I remember the way in." The lock resisted at first, stiff with rust and disuse, but eventually gave way with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. Inside, the cellar air was thick with dust and the particular staleness of a room shut away from the world for years. Christopher lit a small lantern, and together they made their way up a narrow stair into the main archive room above. It was, Marianne thought, like stepping into a tomb built for paperwork rather than bodies, rows of shelves sagging under decades of ledgers and shipping manifests, everything coated in a fine grey film that spoke of complete abandonment. Somewhere in this room, if her father's last cryptic words to her held any truth, lay a vault containing the second half of the coordinates that would finally reveal the resting place of the Osprey's Grace and its cargo. "He said it required more than one key to open," Marianne murmured, moving slowly along the shelves, searching for anything that might resemble a safe or strongbox among the clutter. "I always assumed that meant a second physical key, but I never knew where he might have hidden it, or who else might have held its match." "Perhaps you're not meant to find a second key," Christopher said, crouching before an iron-bound chest set into the wall behind a loose section of shelving, half concealed by shadow. "Perhaps you're meant to provide the second key yourself." He gestured toward the lock, which bore a distinctive spiral pattern etched into its face, a pattern that matched, unmistakably, the brass disc Marianne still carried. Her breath caught. She withdrew the disc with hands that trembled slightly, despite her best efforts at composure, and pressed it against the lock's face. It fit with a precision that could not have been accidental, the etched spirals aligning perfectly, and after a moment of resistance, the mechanism released with a heavy click that echoed through the silent archive. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from decades of damp, lay a single folded chart, along with a short letter in her father's unmistakable hand. Marianne's eyes filled unexpectedly as she recognized the handwriting, shakier than she remembered, but undeniably his. "He wrote this near the end," she said quietly, scanning the first lines. "He says he split the coordinates deliberately, not because he doubted me, but because he feared what might happen if the whole truth fell into the wrong hands too soon. He wanted whoever finished this search to have already proven themselves worthy of the trust, to have faced enough danger and shown enough integrity that the fortune wouldn't simply corrupt them the moment it was found." Christopher said nothing, watching her read, and Marianne found herself grateful for his silence, for the space he gave her to absorb her father's final message without intrusion. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright but steady. "The chart shows the exact stretch of coastline," she said. "North of here, past the salt marshes, near a cove the locals call Smugglers, there's a sea cave marked at the base of the cliffs. That's where he hid the cargo before the ship went down entirely." Then we have what we came for. Christopher rose, folding the chart carefully into his coat alongside the logbooks. We should leave before... The sound of splintering wood cut through his sentence, distant but unmistakable, echoing up from somewhere near the Guildhouse's sealed front entrance. They found us, Marianne breathed. They've found the building, Christopher corrected, already moving toward the cellar stair they'd entered through. Whether they know we're inside it yet is another matter, and one I'd rather not test by lingering here to find out. They moved quickly back down into the cellar, Christopher extinguishing the lantern to plunge them into near-total darkness, broken only by the pale grey light seeping through the entrance above. Behind them, muffled through layers of stone and old timber, came the unmistakable sound of the front doors giving way beneath a determined assault, followed by voices, several of them, moving with purpose through the archive room they'd just abandoned. "There's a rear passage," Marianne whispered, pulling him toward a section of the cellar wall she remembered from her past visit, half obscured by broken crates. "My father showed me this too. I never understood why, until now." Christopher didn't hesitate. Together they pried the crates aside, revealing a narrow gap in the stonework just wide enough to pass through, and beyond it, the grey promise of the coastal morning, waiting to carry them toward whatever came next. The rear passage spilled them out into a narrow alley behind the Guildhouse, and from there into the tangle of fishermen's lanes that wound down toward the harbour. Christopher moved with a certainty that surprised her, cutting through gaps between buildings as though he'd studied the town's layout long before this morning. And Marianne understood then that a duke's education included more than she'd assumed. "Godfrey will have moved the carriage to the northern gate by now," he said, glancing back to be sure she kept pace. "He knows to wait there if we're delayed." They reached the carriage within minutes, breathless but unseen, and Godfrey wasted no time setting the horses into motion the moment they'd climbed inside. But their relief lasted only as far as the town's edge. Looking back through the small rear window, Marianne saw them, 3 riders breaking from a side street behind the Guildhouse, already spurring their mounts toward the northern road. "They know which way we've gone," she said. Christopher swore under his breath, something she suspected he rarely allowed himself in polite company, and rapped sharply on the roof. "Godfrey, the marsh road, not the highway!" The carriage lurched hard to the left, wheels groaning in protest as they left the packed earth of the main road for something rougher and far less forgiving. Marianne gripped the seat, understanding his choice even as her stomach dropped at the thought of it. The salt marshes stretching along the coast north of Oakhaven were treacherous ground even for those who knew them well, riddled with hidden channels and mudflats that could swallow a careless horse to its knees. "You're certain of this route?" she asked. "I'm certain it's the only route Corvus's men won't dare follow blindly," Christopher said. "They're hired thugs, not local men. They'll know the marshes by reputation only, and reputation alone should be enough to make them cautious." He was right, though not entirely in the way either of them expected. The carriage could only carry them so far before the ground grew too soft and uncertain for wheels, forcing them to abandon it near the marsh's edge in favor of 2 horses Godfrey kept saddled and ready behind the carriage for precisely this purpose. Marianne had ridden little since past, but there was no time now for hesitation, and Christopher helped her onto the smaller mare with brisk efficiency before mounting his own horse beside her. "Follow exactly where I lead," he instructed. "The firm ground shifts with the tide, and what held yesterday may not hold today. Trust nothing your eyes tell you about this land, only what I show you." They set off across the marsh at a careful pace that felt agonizingly slow given the danger behind them, picking a winding path between reed beds and channels of standing water that glinted silver under the morning sun. Behind them, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew louder as the riders reached the marsh's edge and, rather than turning back as Christopher had hoped, pressed forward regardless of the risk. "They're not stopping," Marianne called over the wind. "Then they're greedier than I gave them credit for." Christopher urged his horse to a slightly faster pace, still weaving carefully between the safer patches of ground. "Stay close, and whatever happens, don't leave the path I take." The chase that followed was unlike anything Marianne had experienced. Not the desperate gallop of open road pursuit, but something slower and far more nerve-wracking. A careful dance across treacherous ground where a single misstep could mean disaster for pursued and pursuer alike. She watched over her shoulder as the riders behind them, unfamiliar with the marsh's hidden dangers, began to lose the discipline of their formation, spreading out in their eagerness to close the distance. It was their undoing. One rider, pushing his horse too hard through what looked like solid ground, found instead a hidden channel beneath the reeds, and Marianne heard his shout of alarm as his mount stumbled and sank to its knees in black mud, throwing him hard onto the wet ground. A second rider, attempting to swerve around his fallen companion, met the same fate moments later, his horse rearing in panic as the ground gave way beneath it. "Keep moving," Christopher called, not slowing to watch the chaos unfolding behind them, though Marianne could hear relief threading through the urgency in his voice. "The tide's rising. Whatever ground held them a moment ago won't hold much longer." Only the third rider pressed on, more cautious than his companions but no less determined, following the exact path Christopher had chosen rather than risk the open marsh himself. Marianne felt a fresh spike of fear at his persistence, understanding that whoever had sent these men had promised them something significant enough to risk this kind of danger for. "There," Christopher said suddenly, pointing ahead to where the ground began to firm and rise toward higher land, the marsh giving way at last to solid coastline dotted with wind-bent trees. "The northern cliffs. Once we're clear of the marsh, we've the advantage of speed again." They broke free of the reed beds moments later, the ground solidifying beneath their horses' hooves, and Christopher spurred his mount into a full gallop along the cliff path, with Marianne close behind. Their pursuer, delayed by the marsh's treacherous crossing, had fallen back just far enough that the gap between them stretched wider with every passing minute, though he showed no sign of abandoning the chase entirely. "Where does this lead?" Marianne shouted, the wind tearing at her hair as they raced along the cliff's edge, the grey sea churning far below them. "Smuggler's Cove," Christopher called back, and something in his voice carried both grim determination and the faintest thread of dark humor despite everything. "Which, I believe, is exactly where we intended to go before this morning became quite so complicated." The lighthouse at Smuggler's Cove had stood empty for the better part of a decade, its beacon long dark, its stone walls weathered grey by salt wind and time. Christopher and Marianne reached it as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, their horses lathered and exhausted from the long ride along the cliffs, and for the first time since leaving the marsh behind, Marianne allowed herself to believe they might actually reach safety. "We'll rest the horses here," Christopher said, dismounting stiffly and helping her down beside the old tower. "And study the chart properly while the light still holds." Inside the abandoned structure, dust-covered but sheltered from the wind, they spread the chart across a broken table near the base of the spiral stair. Marianne traced the coastline marked in her father's careful hand, comparing it against the logbook's earlier coordinates until the two pieces of the puzzle finally aligned into something whole. "There," she said, pointing to a small inlet marked with a symbol she now recognized as her father's private notation for hidden places. "Just below the cliffs here, accessible only at low tide. A sea cave, sealed by the water most of the day, but open enough at dawn or dusk for a man who knew exactly when to look." Christopher studied the mark, then glanced toward the narrow path leading down the cliff face toward the water. "The tide's turning now, if I judge it right. We could reach the cave's entrance within the hour, before darkness makes the descent too dangerous to attempt." It was, Marianne thought, the closest they had come in 3 days to something like triumph, the full route finally laid bare before them, the fortune her father had protected for 30 years within reach at last. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the night Corvus first grabbed her arm in the tavern. A tension built from months of fear, finally beginning, however cautiously, to ease. That ease lasted only until the sound of a single horse, ridden hard, reached them from the cliff path behind. "He followed the coast road," Christopher said grimly, already moving to gather the chart and logbooks from the table. "Faster than the marsh crossing, and far less treacherous for a man riding alone." They had no time to reach the cave, no time even to properly conceal themselves within the lighthouse's crumbling shelter. Marianne watched through a gap in the stonework as the rider crested the final rise and reined his horse to a stop before the tower, and felt her stomach turn cold as she recognized not one of the hired thugs from the marsh chase, but Corvus himself. His fine coat mud-splattered from hard riding, his face twisted with an anger that had clearly festered through 3 days of humiliation and failure. "Come out, Miss Vance," Corvus called, his voice carrying easily across the quiet clifftop. "I've chased you across half the county for a fortune your father stole from men far more deserving than either of you. I'd rather not make this uglier than it needs to be, but I will if you force my hand." Christopher stepped out first, deliberately placing himself between the lighthouse doorway and the approaching threat, his expression carrying none of the warmth Marianne had come to associate with him over the past 3 days. "Your claim on Miss Vance's debts was settled in full, Corvus. Whatever quarrel remains here is entirely of your own making." "My quarrel," Corvus said, dismounting slowly, "is with the fortune I now understand you're both chasing across half this coastline. Did you truly think I'd simply forget the way you humiliated me in that tavern, Your Grace? A duke paying twice what a debt was worth for a servant girl with nothing to recommend her but a father's secrets. Men don't spend fortunes on nothing. I made inquiries. I learned enough to understand this was never about charity at all." "What you learned," Christopher said coldly, "is clearly incomplete if you believe threatening us on a clifftop will improve your position rather than ruin it entirely." Corvus's hand drifted toward his coat, and Marianne felt real fear grip her for the first time since the chase began. Not the abstract danger of pursuit, but the immediate, physical threat of a desperate man cornered with nothing left to lose. "I've little interest in your threats, duke or otherwise. Hand over whatever charts you've found, and perhaps I'll consider letting you both walk away from this cliff with your lives intact." "And if we refuse?" "Then perhaps the sea will simply have to keep its secrets a little longer," Corvus said, "along with whatever's left of you once the tide comes in." The threat hung in the salt air between them, and Marianne watched Christopher's expression shift into something she hadn't seen from him before. Not fear, but a cold, calculating stillness. The look of a man rapidly assessing every advantage still available to him. She realized with sudden clarity that whatever happened next would depend entirely on which of them understood the true stakes of this confrontation better. A debt collector, driven by greed and wounded pride, or a duke who had spent his entire life learning exactly how much power his title could wield when wielded correctly. "You've made a serious miscalculation, Corvus," Christopher said quietly. "And I don't mean the one you think." Corvus's confidence flickered just slightly at the certainty in the Duke's voice. "And what miscalculation is that?" "You assumed," Christopher said, reaching slowly into his coat, "that I came to this cliff with nothing but a chart and a woman to protect. You should have asked yourself why a magistrate of the regional court would trouble himself with a dockside debt collector's affairs at all before tonight." Corvus's hand stilled halfway to his coat, uncertainty flickering across his features for the first time since he'd dismounted. "Magistrate," he repeated, as though testing the word for some hidden trick. "You expect me to believe a duke troubles himself with the tedious business of the regional court?" "I expect you to believe whatever the evidence forces you to accept," Christopher said, withdrawing not a weapon, but a folded document from his coat, its edges worn from handling. "I've held the appointment for 3 years now, largely as a formality attached to my late father's seat, but a formality carries the same authority as any other title when the occasion demands it." He held the paper out, though not close enough for Corvus to snatch it. "This is a writ concerning the original loan your firm extended to Marianne's father some 8 years past. I had it drawn up this morning, before we ever left Oakhaven, on a suspicion I'd been turning over since our first meeting at the tavern." Marianne stared at him, startled. She had assumed the morning's urgency at the Guildhouse had consumed his every thought. She hadn't realized he'd spared attention enough to set another plan quietly in motion alongside it. "A suspicion," Corvus said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bluster. Men who resort to public humiliation to collect a debt are rarely confident their claim would survive honest scrutiny, Christopher continued. I had my solicitor examine the terms of your original loan against maritime lending statutes this very morning, while you were busy chasing shadows across the salt marsh. The interest you charged Marianne's father exceeded the legal maximum permitted under those statutes by a considerable margin, which renders the entire contract void from the moment it was signed. Every debt you claimed against her, every threat you've made in pursuit of it, was built on a foundation that never held any legal weight at all. Corvus's face drained of color, the anger that had carried him across 3 days of failed pursuit curdling suddenly into something closer to panic. That's a technicality, nothing more. No magistrate would trouble himself over. I am the magistrate, Christopher said, and I assure you, I trouble myself considerably over men who extort desperate women with fraudulent contracts and then chase them across the countryside with hired thugs when their scheme begins to unravel. You've assaulted her in public, pursued her carriage with armed riders, and now threaten violence against a peer of the realm on an open clifftop. Any one of these would be sufficient grounds for your arrest. Together, they'll see you facing the regional court within the week, assuming the local bailiffs don't simply decide the cliffs are punishment enough. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind off the sea tugged at Marianne's cloak, and somewhere below the cliff face, she could hear the tide beginning its slow retreat from the rocks, uncovering the very cave entrance that had brought them all to this dangerous confrontation in the first place. You wouldn't dare have me arrested, Corvus said finally, though the conviction had gone out of his voice entirely. Not without proof I've done anything beyond collecting what I was rightfully owed. I have 3 days of witnesses who watched you drag Marianne across a tavern floor, a driver who watched armed riders pursue my carriage from Oakhaven, and now my own testimony as a magistrate of the confrontation you've staged on this cliff. Christopher folded the writ and returned it to his coat, his expression never wavering. I'd say the proof stands rather comfortably against you, Corvus. The only question remaining is whether you ride away from this cliff now, quietly, and take whatever remains of your reputation somewhere far from Oakhaven, or whether you wait here for the bailiffs I've already sent word to, expect within the hour. It was, Marianne realized, a bluff of sorts. She had seen no messenger sent ahead, no indication that word of their location had reached anyone beyond the 3 of them standing on this wind-swept clifftop. But Corvus had no way of knowing that, and the calm, unshakable authority in Christopher's voice carried a weight that pure bravado alone could never have achieved. She watched the debt collector's resolve crumble beneath the accumulated weight of 3 days' failure, a voided contract, and the very real threat of a magistrate's formal pursuit. This isn't finished, Corvus said, though the words carried no real conviction, the protest of a man already retreating rather than a genuine threat. It is, in fact, entirely finished, Christopher replied. Your claim against Marianne's family was void from the start. Your pursuit of us across the marsh constitutes assault and unlawful threat against a peer. And whatever fortune you imagined waiting for you at the bottom of this cliff belongs, as it always did, to a family you tried and failed to destroy. Ride away now, Corvus, while I'm still inclined to let you keep your horse and your liberty both. Corvus's eyes moved between them one final time, weighing some last desperate calculation Marianne could only guess at, before he turned wordlessly back toward his horse. He mounted with none of the swagger he'd carried onto the clifftop, and within moments he was riding back the way he'd come, a smaller and more diminished figure against the vast grey sky than he'd seemed only minutes before. Marianne let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. You never sent for the bailiffs at all, did you? No, Christopher admitted, the tension finally leaving his shoulders as he watched Corvus disappear along the coast road. But he had no way of knowing that, and a man like Corvus rarely stays to test a bluff once his own guilt has already convinced him it's true. He turned to her, something gentler returning to his expression now that the danger had genuinely passed. The tide's turning, Miss Vance. I believe your father's cave is finally ready to be found. They did not attempt the descent that evening. With the light fading fast and Corvus's true intentions still uncertain, Christopher judged it wiser to wait until morning, when they could approach the cave properly prepared and with trustworthy hands to help. He sent Godfrey ahead at first light to fetch a small crew from the fishing village nearest the cove, men Godfrey had known for decades, whose discretion he trusted as much as their skill with rope and tide. Marianne slept little that night, curled in a blanket near the lighthouse's cold hearth, while Christopher kept watch by the doorway, though whether he genuinely feared Corvus's return or simply understood she needed the reassurance of not being left entirely alone, she couldn't say. By the time the first grey light crept over the water, she was already awake and waiting, watching the tide creep slowly back from the rocks below. "The cave will be accessible for perhaps 2 hours," Christopher said, joining her at the cliff edge as the fishing crew arrived below, their small boat cutting through the calm morning water toward the inlet marked on her father's chart. Long enough if the men move quickly and the cargo hasn't been damaged too badly by 3 decades of sea air. They made their way down the narrow cliff path together, Christopher's hands steady beneath her elbow on the steeper sections, until they reached the rocky shore where the crew had already begun wading into the cave's mouth with lanterns and rope. Marianne stood at the entrance, unwilling to venture farther than necessary into the dark, dripping passage, her heart hammering with an anticipation that had nothing to do with fear of Corvus and everything to do with 30 years of her father's careful, desperate secrecy finally reaching its end. The first shout came perhaps 20 minutes later, echoing strangely off the wet stone walls, one of the crewmen calling out that they'd found something, iron and heavy, wedged deep within a natural alcove that the sea itself seemed to have sheltered from the worst of the decade's erosion. Marianne pressed forward despite herself, Christopher close behind with a second lantern, until she could see it with her own eyes. 3 sealed chests, banded in corroded iron, resting exactly where her father's final crewmate must have hidden them before the Osprey's grace slipped beneath the waves entirely. "They're intact," Christopher said, running a careful hand along the nearest chest's surface. "Sealed well enough that the sea never fully reached what's inside. Your father chose his hiding place with remarkable care." It took the better part of an hour to haul the chests free of the cave and load them carefully into the fishing boat, the crew working with a gentleness that spoke of genuine respect for whatever history the containers held, rather than mere payment for labor. Marianne watched every moment of it from the rocky shore, unable to look away, until finally the boat pushed off toward the small harbor where a cart waited to carry their discovery back to Stirling Manor for safekeeping. It was not until that evening, in the privacy of Christopher's study once more, that they finally opened the chests together. The first held sculptures wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived 30 years of damp sea air with only minor tarnishing, bronze figures of remarkable craftsmanship, clearly foreign in origin, exactly as her father's logbook had described. The second held manuscripts, their pages fragile but legible, illuminated texts that Christopher recognized immediately as work commissioned generations ago for a royal library that had never received its promised gift. And the third, smallest of the chests, held jeweled relics whose value even Marianne, with no expertise in such matters, could recognize at a glance. "It's real," she whispered, running her fingers gently over the surface of a small carved figure that had waited 30 years in darkness for this exact moment. "All of it. Everything he protected, everything he died still trying to finish." "He'd be proud of you," Christopher said quietly, watching her rather than the treasure spread across his desk. "Not simply for finding this, though that alone would be remarkable enough. For refusing to let his memory be reduced to nothing more than debt in disgrace. You've restored something far more valuable than gold tonight, Marianne." It was the first time he'd used her given name without the formality of address, and she felt the small intimacy of it settle somewhere warm beneath her ribs, distinct from the exhaustion and triumph of the day's discoveries. She looked up at him, finding his expression carried none of the careful distance he'd maintained since their first meeting in the tavern, only something quieter and more honest than either of them had allowed themselves to acknowledge across the dangerous days that had brought them here. "We still have one matter left unfinished," she said softly. "My father's name, the debts, my family's home." "Tomorrow," Christopher said, We'll ride for the provincial capital, and I'll see every piece of it set right before the High Court itself, with evidence enough that no one will ever again question the Vance family's honor." He hesitated, something almost uncertain crossing his features for the first time since she'd known him. "And when it's finished, Marianne, I find I'm rather reluctant to let our arrangement end quite so simply as returning you to whatever life debt and desperation once forced upon you." Marianne felt her breath catch, understanding the weight beneath his words even before he found the courage to say more. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future stretching ahead of her felt less like a burden to survive and more like something worth genuinely hoping for. The High Court sat in the heart of the provincial capital, a grand hall of polished wood and towering windows, where Christopher had once watched his own father argue cases of far less consequence than the one he now prepared to present. Marianne stood beside him that morning in a gown Christopher had insisted on providing for the occasion. Deep blue wool, trimmed simply enough that it never felt like charity, only the plain good sense of appearing before a judge properly dressed. "You needn't be nervous," Christopher murmured as they waited to be called forward. "The evidence speaks for itself. I've simply to present it." "I'm not nervous for myself," Marianne admitted. "I keep thinking of my father and how he never lived to see this moment. I wanted so badly to make him proud, and now that the moment's finally here, I find myself wishing more than anything that he could stand here to see it instead of me." Christopher's hand found hers briefly, a small and steadying gesture that drew no attention in the crowded hall, but meant everything to her in the moment. "He is here, in every sense that matters. Everything we've recovered exists because of what he protected. Today simply makes it official." When their case was called, Christopher presented the evidence with the same calm precision he'd shown Corvus on the clifftop. The voided loan contract, the recovered maritime registry proving the artifact's true provenance, testimony from the fishing crew who'd witnessed the recovery, and finally, the logbooks themselves, their decoded pages laid before the presiding judge as proof of a story that had taken 30 years and no small measure of courage to finally reach its conclusion. The ruling, when it came, was everything they'd hoped for. The Vance family name was formally cleared of all outstanding debt, the fraudulent contract struck from record entirely, and the artifacts recovered from the sea cave declared the rightful property of Marianne Vance as her father's sole surviving heir, to dispose of as she saw fit. Corvus, notably absent from the proceedings, was named in a separate warrant for his conduct on the clifftop, though word had already reached them that he'd fled the region entirely rather than face the consequences of his failed pursuit. It was as the court adjourned and well-wishers began to press forward with congratulations that the day's final and most unexpected twist arrived, not from Corvus, nor from any lingering danger they'd left behind on the coast, but from an elderly clerk of the court who approached Christopher quietly, a sealed letter in hand, requesting a private word before the crowd dispersed entirely. "Your Grace," the clerk said, once they'd stepped aside into a quieter alcove. "This arrived some weeks past, addressed to whoever might eventually settle the Vance family's affairs. Given the nature of today's proceedings, I judged it finally appropriate to deliver." Marianne watched, confused, as Christopher broke the seal and scanned the letter's contents, his expression shifting from puzzlement to something far more complicated as he read. When he finally looked up, he handed the letter to her without a word, allowing her to read the truth for herself. It was from the third survivor of the Osprey's Grace, a man her father had always believed lost to illness decades ago, but who had, in fact, lived quietly in a coastal village to the south, carrying his own portion of guilt over the ship's sinking all these years. The letter explained, in a shaking elderly hand, that he had learned of Marianne's search through word traveling along the coast, and wished to confess a truth he'd carried in silence far too long. Her father had not simply stumbled upon the wreck's location through survival and memory alone. He had, in fact, been the one to save the other two men's lives that stormy night, diving repeatedly into the wreck's sinking hull to pull them free before the ship went under entirely, at considerable risk to his own life. The two survivors had sworn, in gratitude, to protect his secret and never speak of the cargo's true fate, a debt of silence they had honored until this final confession. "My father was a hero," Marianne said softly, tears gathering despite her best efforts to hold them back. "Not simply a man who hid a fortune out of fear, but someone who saved 2 lives that night and never once spoke of it, not even to me." "He carried that silence the same way he carried everything else," Christopher said gently. Quietly, and without ever asking for recognition he felt he hadn't earned. It was, Marianne realized, the final piece of her father's story finally falling into place, not merely the treasure he'd protected, but the true measure of the man who'd protected it, revealed only now that the fear which had kept him silent for 30 years no longer held any power over the truth. In the weeks that followed, the artifacts found their permanent home in Oakhaven's Newtown Museum, exactly as Christopher had promised, their story told alongside her father's letter and the account of his quiet heroism for every visitor to read. Marianne's family estate was restored to her outright, the deed signed and sealed within days of the court's ruling, and though she chose to keep the house modest rather than expand it beyond what she needed, she filled it slowly with the kind of steady, unhurried joy she'd never quite believed she'd live to feel. Christopher visited often enough that the staff at Stirling Manor stopped remarking on his absences, and by the time autumn settled over the coast, their partnership of convenience had grown into something neither of them had dared name aloud during those dangerous days on the road, but which felt, by then, entirely inevitable. "Your father would be proud of both of us, I think," Christopher said one evening, as they walked the grounds of her restored estate together, the sea visible in the distance beyond the hills, "though I suspect he'd take rather more credit than either of us for how it all turned out." Marianne laughed, the sound carrying easily on the evening air, and found she couldn't disagree with him at all.